Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It is May 31st, 2022. I am here in studio with my partner in righteousness, Gerardo. Hey, Gerardo.
Hey, John.
Thanks for being with us and arranging this today.
Yeah. Really excited to get into part two.
Yeah. So we just spent a good 3.5 hours interviewing Dr. Thomas Murphy about the second half of kind of his life and career, both as an anthropologist and within the realm of Mormon studies. I won't take the time to recap what we've covered in, 6-7 hours of interviews or more between, I guess, those first two parts and then today.
Yeah,
but
it's a lot.
It's a lot, but it's all really good. We are now going to kind of pivot a little bit, and we are going to be covering a really cool topic that is titled Race and Gender in the Book of Mormon, and it's based on maybe a few articles that Thomas has written, but the one that caught my eye that I noticed from some engagements offline with Thomas is an article called Sin, Skin, and Seed, Mistakes of Men in the Book of Mormon. But there are a couple other ones as well, Imagining Lamanites, Native Americans in the Book of Mormon, and other scriptures, Restoring Voices of the I can't even pronounce that.
Gontoesis
to an Open Canon. So basically, we're going to be talking about the Book of Mormon, race, gender, dark skin, curses, seed, genetics, Rodney Meldrum. It's all going to be in this multi-hour dive into race in the Book of Mormon. And we have back Dr. Thomas Murphy. Hey, Thomas.
Great to be back, John, and thanks for this invitation. And, it was kind of your invitation to discuss this that got Gerardo and I talking and putting this together. So that Sin, Skin, and Seed article, it's an old article now, so it was published in 2005, but I had written it, portions of it at least, very early, right after my near excommunication over DNA. It was kind of my next article following up on the DNA. I did this one, and then I also did one called Simply Implausible, DNA in a Mesoamerican Setting for the Book of Mormon. And this one I presented at Edmonds College, and those that are big YouTube fans can find it by that name, Sin, Skin, and Seed. My old 2003 presentation, I had a lot less gray, and I didn't have a beard, and I wore contacts, so you might not recognize me. But that's out there, an early version of this. I presented a later version that would get published at the Community of Christ has an annual conference, just like the LDS Church. They have a general conference. And the John Whitmer Historical Association hosts a spring banquet before their spring general conference. And in 2004, they invited me to be the keynote speaker at that spring banquet. And this presentation I delivered to an audience of John Whitmer historical members and the church authorities for the Community of Christ, their general authorities were in the audience, and it was actually quite well received.
Well, fun. Well, let's dive in, shall we? If you wanted to give an introduction or an overview of what we're going to be covering, how would you frame it?
I would frame it as an argument, and the argument is this: the concepts of race and gender that appear in the Book of Mormon reflect a 19th century mistakes of men. So key parts of that is that really the concepts, the racial and gender-based concepts that appear in the Book of Mormon give us actually really useful tools in timing when was the Book of Mormon written, because the concepts of race and gender change over time. And so we can actually pinpoint them very clearly to the 1820s, basically by history, okay, by the history of ideas. Okay, they're also a mistake of men in the sense that they're not true. Okay, the concepts of race and gender, as presented in in the Book of Mormon do not match what we know today from biological sciences. So that means that whether you believe those ideas originated with Joseph Smith, like I think, or if you believe they originated with Mormon or Nephi, regardless, they're mistakes of men. They're not true.
And that's how you have today some apologists saying, well, the Book of Mormon is not racist, but Nephi might have been racist.
Oh, he definitely was. Yeah, we can agree there. We can agree there. And I'm going to explain why, basically.
And the term mistakes of men, you may be referencing this later, but that comes from the Book of Mormon, the text of the Book of Mormon itself, which says what? Yeah,
so it says that this basically this document or this record may contain the mistakes of men.
So it acknowledges imperfections.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, is that the reality of the Book of Mormon today is that Mormons or people in the Restoration movement in general are going to be trying to reinterpret it. And this almost gives you permission to reinterpret it. Yeah. And so, and keep in mind that I was presenting this at the Community of Christ. The reason I chose this particular title and framing for the Community of Christ is that at that point they were already in the process of reinterpreting and re-understanding the Book of Mormon. And so it's kind of to foster and encourage that dialogue that we can use the framing of the Book of Mormon itself to start to break down the racism and sexism that's coming from it. And so that is an olive branch, if you will, to believers in the Book of Mormon, after I got in all this trouble, and say, look, let's look at our framing and look at this question in a way that may be less offensive and less distancing, because we need to make some progress on how we're interacting with people who are different from ourselves, and here's a way to do that.
I just right off the bat, I'm really struck. We had a talk at lunch about how much. Oh, we talked the last episode as well, just about how much Gerardo and I like to think about truth claims, and you said too that's also a very important topic for you. I did not think of this episode from one standpoint, because obviously for me, racism, it challenges truth claims just right off the bat. You don't need anything else. But like this fact of like matching up, let's just say racial worldviews with a certain time period as almost like a fossil marker or a tree ring. Mm-hmm. In other words, being able to date something based on a certain racial ideology is really interesting. Because if we saw a document that, if we go 1,000 years ahead and then we find a document that says Black Lives Matter, we'd say, oh, well, it's probably 2020-ish, and if we saw one that said bus boycott, we'd probably go, oh, well, that's probably early 60s. Just by a certain arrangement of words, we would be able to kind of get within a 10-year time period of when that document was authored, right?
Yeah, I mean, you could say the conglomeration, if you put together kind of the intersecting histories of concepts of race and gender in the Book of Mormon, the conglomeration that is packaged together in the Book of Mormon is found no place else besides 19th century New York in the United States in the 1820s.
Yeah.
And so it really pinpoints the date of the production of the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, Mike from LDS Discussions has said like 1,000 times, not only could Joseph Smith have written the Book of Mormon, he's probably the only one that could have written it. Like he keeps,
and we'll see how this story I'm going to tell connects directly with the Smith family and their social network.
Yeah.
So we could say that it had to have come from that social network, and you layer on the autobiographical details, and then it can be nobody but Joseph Smith.
Yeah, right? Fascinating. All right, let's jump in.
Yeah. And so I'm going to kind of update that work. This is not just a rehashing of what I gave to the Community of Christ 20 years ago.
You updated it.
Yeah. So I'm integrating in my newer research on neophyte models for interpreting the Book of Mormon that we discussed in the last episode, at least a basic introduction. And the best example of that in my writing is from an anthology called Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, where I wrote the article you just mentioned, Other Scriptures Restoring Voices of the Gantawisas, or the Clan Mothers, to an Open Canon. And in that article, what I do is look at Iroquois oral tradition. And Iroquois or Haudenosaunee are the indigenous people of the upstate New York, where Joseph Smith produced and said he found the Book of Mormon. And they would have inspired the worldview that creates the Book of Mormon, right? Well, they would have been a part of it. Right. Would have been a part of it. They would have been in dialogue with it. And so I'll be able to name specific characters and stuff that individuals that interacted with the Smith family and were purveyors of these stories, some of which were published, some of which were only available orally. And so it's likely that Joseph Smith participated in a larger oral tradition in dialogue with some Native people at the time, as well as drew upon published sources by Native authors or non-Native authors, say missionaries, like we'll talk a little bit about Ethan Smith, for example, and how Ethan Smith's ideas are part of the same network that Joseph Smith was a part of, and look at how concepts of race and gender play out in that time and place and how they're reflected in the Book of Mormon. And to make a really important point, these concepts of race and gender that appear in the Book of Mormon did not exist and have not been found by archaeologists anywhere in ancient America. Okay, the idea that a dark skin is a curse from God, we have absolutely no archaeological evidence to support that. And the types of gender roles that we see presented in the Book of Mormon are not reflective of the ancient Native cultures. And we'll talk about how Native gender is quite different from the gender as presented in the Book of Mormon. And so if this was an ancient Native American document, women would have played a much more prominent role in the Book of Mormon. And so we can say that this is not a product of what we know from anthropology and archaeology, and particularly from Native teachings, Native oral traditions, and written documents from ancient America. We just don't see those same types of concepts present. And just as a teaser, you've dropped this term neophyte. Mm-hmm. Those who follow Mormonism Live will have heard that term before. But just as a teaser, so this term neophyte would have been used in the early 19th century in upstate New York in reference to Native Americans in some way, shape, or fashion. Is that part of your argument? Yes, and in fact, referring to specific groups of Native Americans. So Native converts to Christianity were called neophytes. Okay. And the other group called neophytes were followers of indigenous prophets like Neolin, Tenskwatawa, Handsome Lake. And then is it part of your thesis that Joseph may have gotten the term Nephite directly from the neophyte term that would have been commonly used? Whether he did it consciously or not, it would be hard to say, but it sure seems like it. Okay. It sure seems like that there's more than a coincidence in the similarity of those names.
Before we start diving in, Thomas, I would like you, because I think we live in a time when most Mormons my age and younger are being raised to stop seeing the Book of Mormon as talking about race at all. Mm-hmm. You know, this reframing of the idea of the dark skin as a curse being taught now as like maybe it was their spirituality, maybe it's not really their skin, to the point where like Mormons are growing up not knowing that the Book of Mormon mentions the word skin. Mm-hmm. And we have even Rodney Meldrum. We had him here on. He's supposed to be one of the biggest experts on the Book of Mormon, especially when it has to do with indigenous people. And he didn't even know that the Book of Mormon calls curse and skin like in the same, like he said that the Book of Mormon doesn't mention curse at all when
You did.
when he talks about dark skin.
Well, yeah, I saw that interview, and it felt like to me he was trying not to offend you or your audience, and not being fully forthright. Because if you actually read what he's written,
Right. He talks about the curse.
It says something different.
Right.
So if you read what he's written versus what he said on your show, they don't agree. And I think Simon Southerton's talked about that a little bit on your show too, and we'll get to that in detail specifically. But his book is about DNA in the Book of Mormon. Is actually quite explicit on the racism.
Right.
And maybe he's been influenced by these trends that you're talking about, and it's possible. Because I called him out for this on an interview on Mormon Book Reviews, that his position is changing. And, I want to give him the grace that that's the possibility, and assume that the reason he was waffling with you is that he no longer believes what he wrote previously.
Yeah. And so it seems like we're living in a time when the church and members want to stop thinking about the Book of Mormon talking about race at all, being about race at all. We want missionaries and want to concentrate on that scripture that says that the gospel is for everyone, for men and women alike, and black and slave and everyone, and it doesn't matter. So it doesn't matter what color skin you are. So why do you think this conversation is important in the context that we're living on, that the church wants to get away from those racial conversations? Even Rodney Meldrum,
Right.
the biggest champion of literalism in the Book of Mormon.
Well, I think it's an example of how racial ideas are changing today, right? And so it gives us a way of time stamping, if you will, our evolving views on race and the church's evolving views on race. And it's clear if you read the church's essay on race that they're rejecting any racism in any form. Okay, and that means the racism in the Book of Mormon. If you take that statement to heart, right? So it means they're rejecting it. But I want to complicate it a little bit by saying the Book of Mormon never uses the word race. Okay, and so that's a really important clue, actually, to the timing. Okay, and we'll get to that.
All right. Yeah. Yeah. I love that intro addition, Gerardo, because, there's this whole, there's the curse and the mark of the curse, but the skin color change wasn't the curse. On the one hand, I could hear you saying, Thomas, that the church denouncing racism and moving away from associating any racist ideology with the Book of Mormon could only be viewed as a positive thing.
Right.
So for, shouldn't we all celebrate?
We should.
That the Book of Mormon is no longer being used to encourage an entire millions of people to have a racist ideologies. Yay. And there was never any accountability, right?
Right.
Which is not a yay, right?
Right. And what it means is we can't take the Book of Mormon literally.
Yay. That's a yay.
So, really, if you really reject racism in any form, you cannot do that and claim that the Book of Mormon is an ancient document at the same time.
Well, you just have to redefine a lot of words.
Yeah, those two are incompatible in my perspective. I'm giving my perspective here.
Yeah.
But those two ideas are incompatible.
Yeah.
Love it.
Okay.
All right.
So I want to start kind of with the anthropologist perspective on biology and culture and how concepts of race, how they're problematic. Okay, again, acknowledging that race is not directly mentioned in the Book of Mormon. Okay, but race, as we've come on to understand it in the 21st century and in much of the 20th and the later 19th century, has been an idea that associates a particular group of people with a subgroup of humans. Okay, so there are the idea is you divide humans into categories. The common categories that are used are kind of a white, black. Sometimes when it's used in colors, you'll hear a yellow and a red expressed, and or you might hear African, European, Asian, maybe sometimes Native Americans, or maybe they're folded into that Asian category. Those ways of dividing humans into kind of biological groupings, they tell us much more about culture than they do about biology. Okay, so these ideas that there are subgroups of humans that exist in the first place, and that the subgroups of, and that each of us belongs to one of those subgroups of humans, those ideas are culturally evolved. They don't accurately reflect the real differences that we find among human populations. So every one of us as human beings is similar to and different from every other human being, okay? And there are real differences. And in racial concepts as they've been constructed in the United States, they key in on skin color, okay? Skin color is a physical variation in human populations. So you see different gradations of skin color in different regions of the world, and based upon your ancestors are going to, and the genes that you inherit, your skin color is going to be on a spectrum, right? And so there are real skin color differences, but those skin color differences do not correlate neatly with any proposed racial grouping, despite those color labels or those geographic labels. We actually see skin color gradation in every one of those populations. So that skin colors change, say within Africa. You will find all the skin colors of the world in Africa. And you will find, even within Native American, within Asian, European populations, you'll find darker skins tend to be found in, say, Southern Europe, lighter skins in Northern Europe. In Asia, you'll find darker skins in Southern Asia, lighter skins in Northern Asia.
Yeah.
In the Americas, you'll find lighter skinned Native Americans in North America. In the further north you go, you'll get lighter. You go towards the tropics, towards the equator, you'll get a darker skin. And then as you go further south into South America, you'll get lighter skin tones in human populations. And so if skin color is our demarcation for races, it's rather imprecise, because we have light-skinned Africans, we have dark-skinned Africans, we have light-skinned Europeans, we have dark-skinned Europeans, light-skinned Asians and dark-skinned Asians. We have light-skinned Native Americans, we have dark-skinned Native Americans. And so when we actually look at human biology, those labels misinform more than they inform us. And so anthropologists, kind of looking at our genetics and at our actual biological differences, we see a much finer picture than racial categories can capture. And so we think they misinform. Anthropologists have been critiquing racial ideas for well over 100 years with strong counter evidence to racial ideas. However, some of those were also promulgated by anthropologists. So you had anthropologists on both sides of the debate about whether races exist or not. But the predominant position, the official position published by the Association of American Anthropologists, is that race is a social construction. It is not an accurate way of representing human biology. And I want to break that down. I've given you a couple of examples, but I want to break it down a little bit more with some examples from actual studies. In the 1970s, the Harvard geneticist Richard Lewontin demonstrated that 94% of the human variation is found within commonly proposed races. So if we use that skin color example that I just said, of the skin color variation that we see within any one of those categories, 94% of the variation is present. Okay. So what we're doing when we break people down into those groups is we're keying in on a superficial difference. Skin color being the ideal representation of superficial, right? We're taking the surface level and we're projecting that throughout the whole body. But our body is actually much more diverse than our surface level appearance. And more recently in the 1990s, Stanford geneticist Luca Cavalli Sforza found that 85% of the variation in human populations can be found in any small regional population of humans. So if you go basically to any village in Europe or in Asia or Africa or the Americas, you're going to find 85% of the variation that exists in human populations. So put it another way, we are much, much more similar to each other than we are different. Wherever you go in the world, biologically speaking. It's not the same with other animals. Okay? So with other animals,
like dogs, for example.
Yeah, or like white-eyed vireos and red-eyed vireos. There's more genetic difference between red-eyed, there's more genetic difference between these two species of red-eyed vireos, so that red-eye and white-eyed vireos are a separate species.
Yeah.
Okay, but we see that if you see them as a bird watcher, it's very difficult to tell them apart. But they are far more different from each other than we as humans are from each other. Yet in our eye, we can barely see the difference unless you've really got good binoculars and you're an expert bird watcher. Can you distinguish the difference between these two very lookalike species? That's essentially a biologist looking at humans. We're the same species. And we are much less diverse than our closest relatives, the chimpanzees. And so chimpanzees have much more genetic variation in their populations than we do. And in a sense, in the biological world, humans are an exception to the norm in that we are all alike. Our differences are strikingly minimal in the biological world. And we think as anthropologists, there's a reason for that. Our ancestors went through a bottleneck in which our genetic diversity decreased, and then went through an expansion of the population afterwards. And as a result, we are one of the most similar species to each other than any that's found on Earth. And that's some of the data to back that up, right? And another way to look at this is if we look at Africa. So Africa is where we find our closest relatives. Chimpanzees and gorillas are our closest relatives genetically speaking. So they share over 95% of their DNA with us, and over 98% with chimpanzees. And those species are found in Africa. So that's a suggestion that our common ancestor with them probably came from Africa. Africa's also the place where we find the fossils that have characteristics that are similar to chimpanzees and humans. For example, the Australopithecines we find in Africa and only in Africa are basically, they're like chimpanzees in most of their body structure, except they walk around upright like us. Okay. And Australopithecines have brains about the size of a chimpanzee and their body size is about a chimpanzee, but they're walking around on 2 feet like we do. And over time, they evolve and eventually become what we call the species Homo. And Homo habilis starts growing larger brains, and then Homo erectus gets even larger brains. And eventually we get to modern humans through some archaic human variations in the way. But that record traces us to Africa. So having that common ancestor in Africa means that all of us are African, descendants at least, right? And so if you think of the LDS Church's racial ban, there's nobody on earth that doesn't have African origin. Okay, so if you're going to base African ancestry as a reason to exclude people from the priesthood, then no human should have priesthood.
Yeah.
And does that mean we all have black skin? No. Okay. but we have all have a heritage in Africa. And when we take Africa and we compare it with the rest of the world, we also find evidence of another bottleneck event, in the sense that there is more genetic diversity in Africa than in the entire rest of the world combined. Okay? And that's because our ancestors came out of Africa into Asia, into Europe, into Australia, and into the Americas. And that, so when we lump all Africans together into one race, we minimize the actual diversity that is found within Africa. And so that starts to break down our concepts of race.
Is it, just to summarize one thing I want to see if I understood, is the closest correlate to dark skin color proximity to the equator?
Yes.
Is that what you said?
Yes.
So that it's not righteousness that determines skin color. It's literally proximity to the equator of your ancestors.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And sin and skin have nothing, or sin has nothing to do with skin.
But it even gets worse than that, because what he's also saying, what Thomas is saying, is that in any dark skinned population, let's say Africa or Native Americans, there's always going to be light skinned Africans, light skinned Native Americans, randomly, and sometimes depending on where you live, right? So it's impossible to say, would be biologically impossible for a certain group of people to all be dark skinned and stay dark skinned, so the white people would know to not mix with them, right?
Right. You know, I was thinking of this Puerto Rican student of mine that after I presented a lecture on this topic, you know, we're having a discussion, and he holds up or passes around this picture of his family. And he says, you know, these are my biological brothers and sisters. And he says, this one everybody thinks is white. This one everybody thinks is black. This one everybody thinks is brown. And they're my biological brothers and sisters. And so it does happen within, skin color variations happen within families.
Yeah.
And I think any of us start looking around in our family, we'll see those things if we pay attention, and especially when you have mixing occurring. And my next example of that is my own family. So my closest biological relatives, the people that share the most DNA with me out of anybody in the world, are individuals that can easily be classified as white, as black, as Asian, as Hispanic, and Native American. Okay, because I happen to have siblings that have married different groups. Okay, so say my brother who married a Japanese woman, so his kids are seen as Japanese American, as Asian, yet they share far more biology with me than with most of the rest of the people in Asia. Similarly, I have another brother who married a Brazilian woman who has Native and African as well as European ancestry. And my nephews, through her, they're very, very closely related to me. If you did a DNA test, I'm going to show up as one of their closest relatives. Yet people seeing them would say they're African American or they're Latin American.
Yeah.
And put them into those categories. Well, this thing that's happened in my family, in my generation, has happened in human generations, in human families and generations since time immemorial. We've always been doing this. Sometimes that stranger just looks a little cuter, you know, or a little more exotic, you know, and humans will outmarry, and they like diversity. Humans select for diversity. And so we've been doing this all along. So there's no place in time where you can say there were once pure races of humans. And then from those pure races, you have different groups. We've always been a mixed bunch.
This idea that we all have Cain's blood in us is that makes the Curse of Cain a non-starter. That's really.
Or another way to look at it. Another way to look at it. But and we'll get to that idea because there's something about the Curse of Cain as it plays out in the Book of Mormon. That is
the other thing you mentioned. I heard in I think an interview on Mormon Book Review that part of our racist past is to compare Africans or African Americans with gorillas. But I remember you saying that if you look at the actual skin of a gorilla, not its hair, it's what?
Well, it's actually chimpanzee. So you're reframing.
Sorry,
Rod Meldrum's misquote of me. Okay, you're accurately quoting what Rod Meldrum said. I said.
Oh, oops.
Okay. But what I actually said, if you go back to the Mormon book reviews, is that the skin color of chimpanzees is white.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And chimpanzees are not the same as gorillas,
but their hair.
Yeah, their hair is dark. I'm not sure what color what skin color gorillas are underneath the skin. I've never seen a gorilla without skin, but I've seen chimpanzees without skin. I mean, without hair. Okay, and they're white skinned. Okay, they're light skinned, and so chimpanzees, our closest relatives,
right,
have lighter skin underneath, and so I had mentioned that as a counter to Rod Meldrum's accusation that scientists were racist because we thought Africans were like gorillas. That's not what we think, and that he hasn't actually studied anthropology, and is a very superficial understanding. Just like you had no malintention in misquoting him, but in your head you don't easily see the difference between a gorilla and a chimpanzee. But me as a professional anthropologist, or I should say in Rod's head, he doesn't see the difference between a gorilla and chimpanzee. And so for me, that's a very important difference. They're very different species. And so I immediately, when he thinks gorilla, chimpanzee is the same thing, for me, they're very different species, and I recognize that. And so
gorillas
his level of superficial understanding of anthropology.
I'm looking it up, and gorillas do have dark skin
underneath,
and chimpanzees have light skin.
Yeah. And like I say, I've never seen a gorilla without hair, so I don't know. Another factor to keep in mind, because the United States is focused on skin color, here's your clue that the Book of Mormon came from the United States, is the references to skin color. Because our racial concepts are based on skin color. That is unique to a particular time and place. It's unique to European colonization. So this is an idea that started in the 15th century, and as Europeans are exploring the world and start encountering people that have a broader range of skin color differences, that focus becomes the primary focus. Prior to that, lots of other features were considered significant, and you'll still see them in racial stereotypes. For example, race is sometimes associated with eye shape and color, sometimes associated with hair texture and hair color, sometimes it's associated with nose shape, sometimes it's associated with body dimensions, height, shortness, longer limbs, shorter limbs, stockiness. These are all physical ways that humans vary from each other. Well, skin color doesn't vary in the same patterns as the rest of those features. And so again, when we look at skin color, we may have a light-skinned person with epicanthic eye folds, or here's a good example from the anthropological record. We have in the Khoisan people of South Africa, we have dark skin. They're not super dark skin. They're a little bit lighter than more towards the equator. So they're a medium range skin color variation. They have epicanthic eye folds that are typically associated with Asians and some Native Americans in these racial stereotypes. And they are the population in Africa that has the oldest genetic lineages found in the world. Okay. And so, well, we're all direct descendants of a common ancestor with them, but they appear to have retained more of what in genetics, what that ancestor was like than the rest of us have. So interestingly, you find these things like epicanthic eye folds in Africa. You find things like blonde hair in Australian Aborigines. And interestingly, you find in the archaeological record of Europe, this is supplemented by DNA because we didn't know this until DNA studies, but we find that 9,000 years ago, people living in the British Isles had black skin and blue eyes. And again, we don't tend to associate black skin and blue eyes in our stereotypes, even though many of us know people that have those features.
Right. Okay,
but we forget that those people exist when we create these stereotypes. But if you're as many Mormons are descendants of British Islanders, you are descendant just a few thousand years ago of black-skinned people. And those are, some of the founding populations of the British Isles. So race is really not an accurate way to describe human variation. And so those give you some examples of why anthropologists reject the concept of race as a valid explanation for human biological differences. And any questions on that you two have?
No. Yeah.
I think you hinted at this, but Native Americans, or if Nephites or Lamanites were like real people who existed, in all of America, they wouldn't be classifying themselves by skin color. Is that kind of what you were hinting at? They would probably, at the time, Native Americans would be associating themselves by other types of features, but skin color was not one of them.
Yeah, and to give you a good example, that seeming how we're here in Utah, the Niue or the Shoshone-speaking peoples, which are some of the indigenous peoples of where we are here. So the Shoshone and the Ute, the Timpanogos are kind of with Shoshone and Ute mixture. These people are right here where we are in Utah. The way that they categorized people in their languages was by food. Okay, so if you break down their terms for each other, you have sheep eaters, you have seed eaters, and it's broken down by what you eat. Okay, and fish eaters, that sort of thing. That kind of way of and you could see how it would be a put down, right? Those are fish eaters, or those are
the farmer and the cowboy should be friends.
So you can see people have always put each other down. People have always had prejudices and stereotypes. It probably has a survival technique for us. It's probably been quite useful for us to be able to quickly divide people into categories, especially friend and enemy, which it's a good thing to know who your enemies are. It's a survival skill. And so we need shortcuts to be able to do that. And so we humans in any part of the world have developed those shortcuts, those stereotypes by which they divide people into groups, but they aren't necessarily skin color.
Right.
And, another example of skin color is in Iroquois oral traditions, and some of the oral traditions out of which they would have some influence on the mound builder culture. If you read Barbara Alice Mann's book, Native Americans, Archaeologists, and the Mounds, she's a Seneca descendant scholar who looks at the mound builder myth, which permeates the Book of Mormon, and its relationship to and difference from the indigenous stories. And there is evidence in the indigenous stories that there were skin color differences, that some people were lighter and some people were darker than others. There is some evidence for that in the oral traditions. But what happens with the mound builder myth is that lighter skinned people, which would have been the people from the north.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if you're in upstate New York and you got people coming across the lakes, the Great Lakes coming down into the New York region, which they did, they traversed. Those people are going to be lighter skinned than the people that are coming from the south, from down where, say, the Cherokee and the Choctaw and the other nations of the southeast, who are the Cherokee are linguistic relatives of the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois. They're coming up and they're going to have darker skin, and so those differences were noted and present to some degree. They were present in ancient America and were present in oral traditions. But what Europeans come along and they hear these stories of mound builders and they say, oh, those light-skinned people were Europeans. No, they were just Northerners. They were just people from the north versus people from the south. And so you can't jump to the conclusion that they're Europeans just because there's a reference to a lighter skin color.
This reminds me of this painting in Mexico. I don't know if you've heard about it. It's a I don't know, can't remember if it's Nahua or Maya, but it's a painting that church apologists have used to point out, because he has dark skinned people and light skinned people, and Mormon apologists have pointed out to that to say, oh, those are the Nephites, those are the Lamanites, where it could be, like you were saying, just Native Americans that living in the area of Mexico who just happen to have a different skin color.
Yeah, I mean, you see it in native populations today.
Right.
So it's definitely there. And it also could have been whatever paint they were using. Maybe they ran out of this particular paint, or maybe somebody mixed the paint a little bit too thin in this one, and a little bit too thick in that one. Could have been a lot of things.
Right.
But there definitely were not ancient Europeans or ancient Israelites in the Americas. We know that for certain from DNA.
Yeah.
And so, but there were differences in skin color, and that they did occur. Now,
I guess that we can say the British certainly cared about skin color separate from the Americans, because that whole, the Indian caste system, did the British impose that on the Indian subcontinent? Do you even know about that? That's probably
I'm aware of it, and I'm aware that that lighter skinned castes tend to be tend to be the wealthier classes and stuff in
caste is based on skin color in India, as far as I know.
I don't know.
The skin,
I don't know to what degree that was a result of British influence, but it was already there in the geography, and some of those northern nations were the more predominant nations, so it may have pre-existed to British, But again, it's also possible that it was there before, and there could have been prejudices and stereotypes in ancient America too about skin color that existed. I haven't seen it represented in the stories I'm familiar with in the same way we see in the Book of Mormon. I don't see that, but it's possible that people had stereotypes both in India and in the Americas, and that skin color, because humans will use whatever differences we see to categorize each other. It is very likely that has at times been used by many different populations.
One other quick question I have, and this is just an aside. When I think about Alaskan natives or Eskimos, I don't know if that's an okay term to use.
Inuit.
Inuits?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I don't think of them as particularly light-skinned, but they're way more north, like parallel to what I would think would be Scandinavian kind of countries. Do we have any explanation for that? Or
that's been a puzzle for anthropologists that we've wrestled with, but there's kind of different ways to look at it. One is that the Inuit people are lighter skinned than, say, people from Oaxaca or from Mexico. So you do have some differences, but I'm going to get into a little bit of the biology of it. There are lighter skinned populations in the north, the lighter and darker within the Inuit. So it's not as light as we see in Europe. Okay, and I think that's what you're saying. or Asia, for example. In Asia, there's some really light skin tones in Northern Asia, and so what anthropologists believe, and this is kind of jumping ahead to some later things, is that is diet related. Let's just put it that way. That is diet related, and we'll get to the details later. I want to address next Rod Meldrum's racism. And, I appreciate the fact that you had Rod Meldrum on, and that Steve Pinecker has had him on Mormon Book Reviews, and that I've had the chance there to respond to him directly. And I appreciate having a chance here to respond to the interview that he had here. Can
I ask you a question at the high level?
Sure.
We received a lot of pushback that it was irresponsible for us to even interview him, just because some people find a lot of his ideology to be very distasteful or worse. Mm-hmm. For me, I just felt like it's important to get people on the record as to what they're, as a matter of history. You know what I mean? Even if you don't find their views particularly tasteful, I just like the transparency of it all. As an anthropologist, I guess I'm asking a leading question, but I want your blessing.
Yeah, well, I'll say I don't listen to Mormon studies because I agree with all your guests, but I'm a big fan of Mormon stories, and it isn't because I agree with all your guests. And the same with the other shows that I watch. I'm a big fan of Mormon Book Reviews and of Gospel Tangents and Saints and Scholars, and I even listen to some of the what was the one that Latter-day Perspectives, and I listen to podcasts because I want to hear people's stories, and I do think for me, what you started out with Mormon stories was a very big umbrella. And by no choice of your own, I think your excommunication and alienation from the church has narrowed that umbrella. And your attempt to bring in voices like Rod Meldrum, I see as an effort to build that umbrella back out. And I think that that's an important thing to do. I don't think you need to agree with every guest. And I think that challenging, I think we should take the time to listen to each other and respectfully agree and disagree. And so I hope my comments are meant in a respectful way for Rod Meldrum. But more important than for Rod, I don't think he's probably likely to. He may change some ideas in listening to me, but I'm more concerned about Rod's children and grandchildren, and the children and grandchildren of people like that believe in what Rod teaches. Like so, Kara Burrell, for example, and her family, as a big advocate of Meldrum, and my mother was a big advocate, a friend, or at least an acquaintance of Rod Meldrum. Carrie, my wife's parents, sent us Rod Meldrum's DVDs. And so I think there are a lot of children and grandchildren of Heartland advocates among your audience. And I hope that by sharing what I have to say, that I can help them to wrestle with it. It's not so likely that I'm going to change Rod's opinion.
Yeah.
Okay.
That makes sense.
But there are people in their families who are dealing with this, and they need the resources to be able to deal with it. And so I think you bringing him on and opening this dialogue is a gift to those children and grandchildren.
Yeah, I feel better. Let's make a clip of that, Gerardo.
But let's be clear that I don't agree with a lot of what Rod did, and I also. I don't envy your role as the interviewer there. And I saw you struggle at times, and I had empathy for both of you, for Rod at times, because I think you were hard on him, and for you at times, because I think Rod was evasive towards you. So I had empathy on both sides, and that's probably a pretty good balance. And, I don't know that I'd have done any better. How you got through it without having a shouting match is remarkable. And so anyway, in rediscovering the Book of Mormon remnant through DNA, Rod Meldrum's original book on DNA, he projects the biblical characters Ham, Shem, and Japheth onto human populations, Africans, Europeans, and Asians. And what he may not realize is that there is nothing in the Bible to justify that.
Yeah.
Okay? If he actually reads the Bible carefully, he's not going to find any justification for that. That is an idea that has a history. Okay? That idea that the three sons of Noah correspond with geographic groupings of people, and then later with races, is a byproduct of European exploration and colonization. Okay, that idea did not exist in the Bible. Still doesn't exist if you have a good translation of the Bible. There might be some problems with some translations, or there may be footnotes or Bible commentaries that make these suggestions. But when you see those ideas appearing in the Bible commentaries and in the historical record, it corresponds with the age of European exploration. What you see in the Bible itself is a kind of a geography of Palestine and Israel at the time that those texts were written. And so it helps us date this. So his perspective is a colonial perspective. It's a reflection of European colonization. And it's a way of seeing the world through that lens. And so this is what really becomes important in dating those racial concepts that come in the Book of Mormon, is that once we start seeing the populations of the world as being associated with particular sons of Noah, we know we've got a colonial document. Okay, we know that it postdates the European colonization. And so he's, in that sense, Rod Meldrum is engaging in anachronism in his interpretation. Okay, he's misreading the Bible. He's not accurately representing the Bible, but he's bringing the traditions he was raised with, that he didn't invent, okay, but he's just repeating what he's been told the Bible says instead of actually reading the Bible.
Because my understanding is that the Bible doesn't even mention like dark skin or that idea, right?
Yeah,
right?
So we're going to get to that, because that association of particular populations with dark skin, there are a little bit of references to that might, to light and dark and stuff. There are some references that are used that way, but within the context of when they were written, there's not a strong association. And we'll get to some of the specifics. But Meldrum claims that Lamanites, which he interprets to be the ancestors of American Indians, were cursed by God with a dark skin for their wickedness. And of course, Rod Meldrum didn't invent this idea. Okay, this is a predominant Mormon belief. Not all Mormons believe it, importantly. Okay? And it, of course, comes from the Book of Mormon in the idea that the gods were cursed with a dark skin for their wickedness. That's a racist idea. Okay? And so that gives us a really challenge. We can either say we are racists, and I think that's what you wanted or what Rod Meldrum thought you wanted him to say, is yeah, I'm a racist, which, most people won't do. I mean, even Donald Trump would admit he was a racist, and I can't think of very many more racist people out there. So I hope I didn't offend some of your viewers. Again.
Hey, Mormon Stories is apolitical. Thomas Murphy's comment does not represent necessarily the opinions of the Mormon Story staff.
Yeah, but racists usually don't admit it, okay? And really, at some level, all humans are prejudiced towards each other and, and ethnocentric. And if we're honest with ourselves, we'll acknowledge that we take shortcuts in identifying people. And we can be honest about it. Meldrum also blames in his book very explicitly Native Americans and Jews for causing their own genocides.
Wow.
This is a really problematic idea that
Because the Book of Mormon does that, doesn't it?
See, there's his problem, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, that's the problem that Meldrum has is he's a rather literal reader of the Book of Mormon.
Right.
And that's going to get him in trouble. It really is. I'm going to give him...
Or keep him out of trouble.
Yeah.
Depending on
Right,
trouble
on the context, yeah. And to me, to blame the victims of genocide for causing it is gaslighting. It's morally repugnant. It's also biologically unfounded. Okay, in the idea that Native Americans got a dark skin because they were wicked, and their wickedness caused them to have to suffer European colonization. It's deeply wrong on a very moral level. And it's wrong because there's no biological link between skin color and morality. Okay, nowhere have I seen any scientific evidence that would support a link between a person's moral decisions and their skin color. It's not there. Okay, and so to say a dark skin is a curse for wickedness is wrong. Whether it's Nephite saying it, whether it's Rod Meldrum saying it, or whether it's President Nelson saying it, it's wrong. And mistake. It's a mistake of men. And the Book of Mormon gives us permission to read it and identify mistakes of men. And so that's where some of this stuff that you're hearing, well, maybe the Nephites are racist. Okay? Not maybe. They were. And more importantly, this excuses the crimes of European settlers and Nazis. Okay? And this starts to tell you whose ideas these are. Who is it that would blame Native Americans and Jews for their own holocausts?
Yeah.
The perpetrators. And every one of us with European ancestry are part of those perpetrators in the Americas.
Never thought about it that way, because literally the Book of Mormon says that.
Yeah. And so the perpetrators of genocide are going to try to excuse their behavior by blaming the victims.
Yeah.
And this is very classic human behavior in, say, conflict studies, the types of ways that the humans think and rationalize those types of behaviors. The other thing that Meldrum does that's deeply problematic is he links DNA lineages with race. Okay, so in his book, he categorizes the world into three groups: the descendants of Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And then he divides the world into three races: the black race, the European race, and the Asian race, or the African, European, and Asian race in his terms. And that is fundamentally wrong in terms of understanding human genetics. To use the example that he likes to key in on is the X lineage. Mm-hmm. So there are five major maternal lineages found in Native American populations: A, B, C, D, and X. The X lineage is the only one found outside of North and East Asia. Okay, so those A, B, C, and D really strongly link Native American populations' closest relatives to North and East Asia. X lineage is a little more ambiguous, okay, and that's why Rod Meldrum likes to key in on it. But he calls the X lineage European. There's no biological justification for that. The X lineage is actually quite rare in European populations. It's quite rare in Native populations. It's quite rare, even rarer in Asian populations. It's rare in African populations. But it's present in all of them. Okay. We could call it a Native American lineage. We could call it an Asian lineage. We could call it an African lineage, but he calls it a European lineage. Why? Because it serves his interest, right? It serves his racial biases and prejudices. He wants there to be an ancient white race in the Americas. He associates whiteness with Europe. He associates whiteness with Shem. So he links the X lineage and this kind of racialized thinking. There's no sound biological basis for doing that. And I want to give an example of how that plays out in my anthropology classes. So at Edmonds Community College, or now Edmonds College, for the last over 20 years, in my biological anthropology classes, and so I've taught this class multiple times a year for over 20 years. So I've had to have done this probably over 100 times. Okay. And in this class, I have students extract their own mitochondrial DNA. And so they get to extract it. I have them develop hypotheses about their relations with other members of the class. And then we amplify their DNA, and then we send it to a lab to be sequenced. And so then they get their actual sequences of their DNA, which are these base pairs that are like letters, A, T, C, and G, adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. And this string of letters, each of which is unique. Okay. The only time I've had students come up with, well, actually, they weren't exactly non-unique. There was two sisters, and they had one base pair difference between them. And I've had a couple other times students have only had one base pair difference in this segment of the DNA. So we sequence a portion of the mitochondrial DNA called the control region. And so it gives us a portion of their maternal lineage to look at. And it'll give us a good indication because it's a hypervariable portion of that genome, of the mitochondrial genome. It'll allow us to make good genealogical comparisons. Who's your closest maternal relative in the class? So I have them predict who their closest relatives are. And what do you think is the most likely way they do that?
I'm going to just go out on a limb and say skin color.
Yeah, right. That's the typical way they'll do that. Or they might use geographic origin, which has some correlation with skin color, right? And so they base these hypotheses, and every single quarter, having done this over 100 times, over 20 years, I have never had a class where the mitochondrial lineages fell neatly by race. In other words, in every single class, most of the students found their closest relatives crossed racial lines. And so when you are discriminating against somebody of a different skin color, you are likely discriminating against your own relative. There's a good chance you are. And so when we start breaking it down at genetics, race as a concept busts. It falls apart. It doesn't work. Okay, and that seems to be lost on Rod Meldrum, although hopefully he's learning from having these dialogues at least via podcast. So to sum up here, race is a social and cultural construct that tells us far more about our prejudices and our stereotypes than it does our biology. And importantly also, and I mentioned this, but we're going to kind of go into it in a little more depth, concepts of race change over time. So racial concepts in the Book of Mormon provide a key to identifying the time and place of its origins. And as I mentioned earlier, the term race doesn't actually appear in the Book of Mormon. And that is a clue to its timing. Okay? Because race as a concept explodes in the mid-19th century in the United States. What you have occurring in the early 19th century is a transition between two different ways of thinking about human biological variability. So these point us very concisely to the early 19th century. And just kind of to break into generalizations, those two different ways of thinking about human biological differences. In the 18th century and still in the early 19th century, you had people who tended to think of race, of what would become known as races, or as, let's say Native Americans. So the explanations that were being used in the 18th and 19th century for Native American skin color, okay? You've got James Adair, who is a trader writing about Native Americans in 1775 in a book. He tries to tie Native Americans to ancient Israel. He's one of the early propounders of the 10 lost tribes of Israel concept. And his understanding of skin color in 1775 is that it is environmentally caused, okay? And he says that Native people spend a lot of time outside. That darkens their skin. They also tend to paint themselves, and there is some grounds for it. That some of the insect repellents that were being used, involved kind of a reddish clay that would make sense. Okay, so that he's saying the reason they're red is because they're outside a lot, and they're in this temperate environment outside, and they use paints and pigments on their skin. Okay, so he saw it very much in an environmental context. Part of the reason he said his justifications for that is that if you see children, they're born lighter skinned and they get darker skinned over time. Okay, and so notice in his idea that skin color is variable over a lifetime. Think about it. Okay, skin color is variable over a lifetime, and that it is environmentally influenced. It's malleable. Okay, so that idea that you see in the late 18th century is in the early 19th century starting to undergo some changes. Okay, and you get, especially by the mid-19th century, you get really heated debates in the United States about slavery, okay? And at the time you're getting these really heated debates about slavery, ideas about race begin to change, okay? And so the advocates of slavery started to see skin color as an unchangeable attribute, okay, as a marker of race, okay, of a marker of a category of people. And so that race becomes a category you're born into and you can't escape. Okay, where notice that James Adair and Joseph Smith will see race as malleable and changeable. And later, by mid-19th century, the predominant advocates of slavery were insisting that race is fixed, it doesn't change, that you're forever, and you're forever stuck in that. Not only that, but white people are at the highest level, and then black people are at the bottom, and the other colors in between. That idea is, again, a mid-19th century idea, post-dating the Book of Mormon, okay? So this really becomes a key. We can say the Book of Mormon occurred in the early 19th century because it has malleable concepts of skin color, the idea that skin color changes over time. Now, in Adair's work, he saw that as a product of the environment, the physical environment, the natural world, okay? Joseph Smith, thinking in more of a kind of a magical world thinking, saw it more like an alchemist might see it, okay, as in a moralistic universe, so that skin color is variable on the basis of morality, okay, but the variability is present in that particular time period. And so it's fascinating that the Book of Mormon's concept of skin color is actually a variable one. And there's actually a really good book by Max Mueller, an historian who looks at the concept of race in the Book of Mormon. And he's a non-Mormon historian, and he kind of paints the Book of Mormon in somewhat favorable perspective, pointing out how it was not nearly as racist as some of the things that came later. That is his argument. I'm not totally convinced by his argument, but I do agree with it on one significant level, and that is the idea of race as unchangeable postdates the Book of Mormon. And the Book of Mormon falls in this earlier idea of race as changeable. And is one more racist or less racist than the other? You still end up with the same problem.
Yeah.
And that is the expectation that people become white.
Right.
Okay. So the Book of Mormon expects that with the conversion to Christianity, you will become white. And Max Mueller in his book tries to make that out to be a state of colorlessness or state without color, that white means not colored. Or I find that a little bit harder to believe, and I'll get to some problems with that. So
it's kind of like white is pure, not white, or white represents all the colors in the spectrum, or some weird.
Yeah, I mean, well, what it reflects is a Christian worldview that humans are kind of perfectible, or we can change, we can improve, okay? And so that we can be converted from one position to another, and it's taken that cultural thing and projecting it onto the skin, okay? So in one sense, all humans can be saved, okay? And you find Mormonism is in the midst of this debate, because you have the Book of Mormon in 1830, you have the Book of Abraham. I don't remember the exact year of the Book of Abraham, but over a decade later. And it has a much more kind of fixed concept of race and takes a little more like those racist ideas that are developing at the time. And so, yeah, I better keep to my outline here. I want to next make another biological argument. Any questions before I move to that?
No?
All right. So the Book of Mormon proposition that skin color reflects states of righteousness or wickedness is inconsistent with biological knowledge. And so now I want to explain, what do we know about skin color, biologically speaking? Well, skin color reflects differences in melanin production across populations. So it's the amount of melanin in our skin and the type of melanin in our skin that affects the tone or the color of our skin. And those differences have evolved in response to geographic variation in exposure to ultraviolet light. So we mentioned earlier, John, we were talking about how around the equator, skin color tends to be darker and tends to be lighter in the northern and southern latitudes. And that is a direct correlation with the exposure to ultraviolet light. And so again, we have that gradation across populations. Darker skin appears to provide some protection against skin cancer and against the destruction of folic acid, which is a type of vitamin B that's really important in human reproduction. So if you have a deficiency in folic acid, you're much more likely to have children with birth defects. So it can have a very direct impact on our reproductive success. And so that's how biologists understand the changes in our biology and the variability of traits is in the amount of reproductive success that we have. And lighter skin appears to provide some protection against cold injury and aids in the processing of vitamin D from the sun, which helps to protect against diseases like rickets that cause like bending of your bones and that sort of thing. And so in that sense, skin color reflects natural selection, not divine disfavor.
Right.
And now I want to come back to that question you asked earlier, John, about the Inuit people having a little bit darker skin than this model would predict. And anthropologists have noticed that. And what they've done is some studies of diet and found that Inuit people have a diet very high in vitamin D. And so that they're getting their vitamin D from other sources and don't necessarily need it from the sun. And so that what you're seeing is less of an evolutionary pressure or selective pressure on the populations. So it's almost like it is the exception that proves the rule. Okay, it's just another source of vitamin D that's showing that basically skin color is an evolutionary adaptation to ultraviolet light, but also other factors such as our diet and our use and process of vitamins.
I think I've read something about also the long days, right? And the UV effects when there's a lot of, because Alaska would have very, very long days.
Summers,
yeah. And the dark skin would protect against UV exposure on those.
Yeah, it certainly would provide that protection as well. And I've seen that in some of the literature as well. That is a good hypothesis and so is the diet, but the diet has been verified. I mean,
right.
That hypothesis has been tested. And you can test that hypothesis by the amount of daylight as well. So you do have some means of testing that. But the one that's more predominant but in anthropology is the diet.
I mean, do Scandinavian countries have long days similar to
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so the idea that Native Americans should become white and delightsome has caused considerable harm. Okay, so if I come back to Max Mueller, who I consider a colleague and a friend, even though I have this disagreement with his interpretation that white is used in the Book of Mormon is not some status of non-race. And his argument for that is kind of looking at 3rd Nephi, that there's, when Jesus comes and there's no whites among us, that you get a society without race. Okay? And that separates culture from skin color in a way that's deeply problematic. But it is a way that Mormons have defended the Book of Mormon in saying that it's less racist than at least what came after it. And when Max Mueller's making that statement, he's engaging in an anachronistic analysis. He's using what post-dated the Book of Mormon to analyze and compare to the Book of Mormon. What I'm going to do as we go forward is I'm going to look at what predated the Book of Mormon. What were the ideas that Joseph Smith was operating with, and how do his ideas compare with those of his contemporaries, not people who followed him? Because I would agree with Max Mueller that the Book of Mormon is not as racist as advocates of slavery in the 1850s and 60s, as Confederates, basically, okay? I would agree that it's not as racist as that. But the Book of Mormon, that doesn't make the Book of Mormon non-racist. That doesn't make the Book of Mormon an advocate against racism. And that,
because there's this idea on the Race and the Priesthood essay that, well, yes, Brigham Young might have taught some bad ideas, but everyone else was racist, like Christian, like everyone else in the United States was racist. So it's not really that important. So the analysis you're going to do is like comparing Joseph's ideas with his contemporaries. Actually, I think it would be interesting to hear.
Yeah, and the way we often do it in Mormon history now, it's become quite favorable, and you'll see Paul Reeves is a good example of this, that compares Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, and Armin Moss had done similar sorts of analysis, and it's very clear that in terms of who's more racist, that Brigham Young is more racist than Joseph Smith.
Right.
Okay, and so that we can look favorably on Joseph Smith in relationship to Brigham Young. Okay, but to me, the real more difficult question is, how does Joseph Smith compare to Ethan Smith?
Yeah.
How does Joseph Smith compare to James Adair? Well, who's a generation earlier, but a generation or two earlier? Or how does he compare with Samson Occam? These are people who lived at the same time as him, and the picture's not as sweet for us Mormons in that regard. But I want to point out the really dreadful consequences of the thinking that becoming white and delightsome, once we change it to pure and delightsome, that somehow Native people still should become pure and delightsome or white and delightsome. What has that done to actual Native people in the United States? And I just want to make a brief list of the problems that has produced. Mm-hmm. One challenge is that it became advocated by Joseph Smith and Brigham Young that white men should marry Native women to help turn them white. Okay, and I don't have, being a descendant of one of those types of marriages, I don't have a problem with that idea of Europeans and natives marrying each other. I don't have a problem with that idea, but I have a problem of using that as a way to advocate a particular direction of cultural change, okay, as a whitening of a population. That is in essence what anthropologists call a form of settler colonialism. It's the idea of displacing the native population with an immigrant population. And that is essentially what we've done in the United States. But using marriage as a practice to do that, that's a lot of what I've written about in some of my other articles on my own ancestry, my wife's ancestry, and the way that that's played out in actual Native people's lives. I discuss a lot in an article called Views from Turtle Island that appears in the Palgrave Handbook of Mormonism. And it's caused a lot of pain and difficulty for many people that are descendants of these early marriages. There was over 100 of these marriages between white men and Native women in the 19th century. And as a product of some of those and married to a product of some of those, it's I've seen firsthand the turmoil and struggle that's come from this pressure that descendants should be white, mm-hmm. And that it's erasure of some of our ancestry. Another thing that Mormons did in the 19th century, and my wife's ancestor appears to have been one of the first of these Native children and women that became servants and slaves in Mormon homes. So her ancestor, Penina Shropshire Cotton, it was a Cherokee woman who became a servant in the home of Daniel Wood, who was a prominent Mormon, worked on the temple in Nauvoo as a guard for the temple, and he would marry his servant Penina in the Nauvoo temple, be the first plural marriage between a white man and a Native woman that's documented in the church, and then Penina would come out west on the second wagon train, and after there was a conflict not far from where we're at here, there was a fight in Utah Valley between the Timpanogos Utes and the Mormons, in which they basically stole the children that were orphaned in the conflict and brought them into Mormon homes as slaves and servants. And so here is Penina herself, one of those servants, now a plural wife, and these Timpanogos children are put in her care to help her with her labor. And so she was basically a servant or a slave, depending on, Mormons like to use the term servant, but for the life of the people, there wasn't a lot of difference between being a servant and being a slave.
Wow.
And so this practice of taking Indian children out of their homes and from their families, making them into servants or slaves in Mormon homes as a process of whitening them, that's caused tremendous harm to indigenous people. And, there were hundreds of Native children taken in the 19th century into Mormon homes as the servants and slaves. That would continue in the 20th century and be formalized into a church program known as the Indian Student Placement Program. And if you read the histories of the placement program, they usually start with Helen John, who was a Navajo child who asked a Mormon family to help her go to school. And it's a really beautiful story. It makes Mormons sound like they're doing this really great service for Native people, but it ignores over a century of bringing Native children into homes as servants, and erases that experience and tries to make the placement program as a charity program in terms of Mormons helping Natives. And actually, when you look at the 19th century journals of Mormon families caring for those Native children, they understood what they were doing very much in the same terms that the placement program parents did. They saw themselves as uplifting, as whitening Native children, and it was still Native people being labor for white Mormons. And one of the really problematic ways that this is played out in the United States is that in a policy known as the termination policy that became the predominant policy of the United States government in the 1950s. And I mention this because this was orchestrated primarily by Mormon politicians. And this policy of termination basically operated on the idea that tribes as sovereign governments were an antiquity that needed to be done away with. And the idea of termination was that the United States should end its costly relationships with tribes that are a product of treaties in which the United States had obtained the land. And so to free the United States from its obligations under those treaties, basically to continue paying rent for the land that we're living on, the United States should just declare tribes non-existent. We should just dissolve them. They no longer exist. This became official U.S. policy, written in part by LDS politicians and justified by their interpretation of the Book of Mormon. And it was essentially erasing Indians legally, if not in fact. It was a form of genocide.
If you get rid of the landlord, there's no rent to pay, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, and so these are byproducts of the way of thinking of the Book of Mormon. So the Book of Mormon idea that Native people can become white and delightsome is not neutral, and it's certainly not beneficial. It's actually on a cultural level deeply harmful, and has impacted in profound and negative ways Native lives throughout or since 1830.
Yeah.
And for those that are interested in this history, I do want to mention that I'm happy to give free copies of Views from Turtle Island to those that message me on Facebook with an email, because I need to send it via email. I can send you a free copy, or you can buy it online or get it in a library for free. But online, they're selling it for $30, and I don't get any anyway. So I mentioned this in the last interview, and I got a lot of takers on the Mormonism Live. So it's my gift to viewers for taking the time to get this far into the story.
Maybe we'll add that to the show notes.
Yeah.
I do have a question that some will find not to be very politically correct, but I think it's a fair question to ask. I think it's maybe an important question to ask, and I think it's informed by some Native accounts of participants, former participants in the Indian placement program. I would imagine there's an argument to be made, obviously, for not breaking up families, for not doing cultural genocide, for all the ills of the Indian placement program. I also imagine that poverty is problematic, and whether it's, abuse or just lack of food or nutrition, or some would want to say alcoholism or whatever, that, or poor education, that, it's awful to take kids out of their families and put them in a higher socioeconomic status kind of style of living. There are participants in the Indian placement program that I've communicated with who are like, hey, I'm really glad I did it. And I, compared to what I was in, it probably saved my life. And I know that there were probably slaves in antebellum South that were like, hey, I've got it pretty good. So I'm aware that even this line of questioning is fraught. But since you're an expert, I wanted to put that back to you, because I've heard it from participants of the program. I mean, it's one thing for me to have strong opinions against the Indian placement program. It's another thing for me to listen to participants tell me they are glad they went through it. So I'm going to put that back to you and just ask you what your / an anthropologist's response would be to that kind of argument or response.
Yeah, it's a great question, because I also know people that have told me the same thing. And I quote some of them in my article. Okay, so from my perspective as an anthropologist, I want to make sure those stories are told too, because they do complexify the story. And they do show that in the choices that people were making in that particular time and place, maybe their choice was between a boarding school where they would be beaten for their speaking their language, or a Mormon home where they didn't have anybody to talk to in their language. Okay, both were poor choices. Okay, and maybe the Mormon one in some cases was better than the other options.
Well, also what I want you to add there is staying home on the reservation, where, I don't know, maybe in theory they could have died from some type of neglect or abuse. I'm making that up, but you didn't add that as a third option.
Yeah, but there was genuine poverty and suffering and trauma on Native reservations, still is today. And so that, the idea of being able to escape that, it would be attractive to people. And so I think it's important to understand the different motivations. And just to give you an example of the way I've approached that in the article, you look at the church ultimately decides that the placement program was a failure. Okay, and they see it as a failure because what happened is that most of the Native students that came and lived in Mormon homes did not stay Mormon. Okay.
That's one way to evaluate its failure.
From the church's very selfish perspective, the program was a failure. But there are individual Native people who saw this as an opportunity to get an education. And so they utilized the church and those networks as a way to get an education, go to BYU, and get a degree, and have been able to, in many times, do great work in their own communities as a result of it. So they took a really settler colonial institution and adapted it for their own purposes. The church's intent was to make them white and delightsome, but they just became more effective Native administrators, and they became many of the bureaucrats and many of the tribal leaders have a history in the Indian placement program, but they insisted on staying Native rather than becoming Mormon. And so I think that's a twist to the story that, again, I emphasize in the article, and I think is a very important part of it. But if we only focus on those stories and we say that that is the whole of the story, that it was good, the Indian placement program was good for Native people overall, then what we're doing is we're erasing those students for whom it wasn't good. And keep in mind, most did not return from year to year. So if it was so great for most of them, why didn't they keep coming? And then it also ignores the social structures that created that problem in the first place. That process of settler colonialism, which Mormons were participating in, perhaps with a little more benign version of colonialism, but it was still colonialism.
Yeah. Well, I think the question is intent, right? Like, I think it really gives us a good picture when we realize why the church stopped doing it, because it was not bringing the results they were looking for, which the results they were wanting was to colonialize natives.
Yeah. But Native people are smart.
Right.
They figured out, here's an opportunity. I want to go to college, and here's an opportunity to do it. So some did, and they've made good on that. And so it may be a positive in their life, but it didn't necessarily make them a good Mormon.
Yeah.
This is just a thought that just came into my mind. I wonder if anybody's ever studied the trajectory of Native American converts in the mid 19th century with, let's just say Tongans or, Maori or Samoans. Because in any of us who were alive during Spence W. Kimball's administration would remember the massive, intense emphasis on Native Americans, especially North American Native Americans, Apache, Navajo, and all the missionary efforts to all those cultures, which of course culminated in the Indian Placement Program, which was a disaster, both for them, but also by the church's own admission for the church. It was a failed program. They didn't do that with Pacific Islanders. They didn't displace people out of their families and bring them here and stick them in white homes. I wonder what the socioeconomic status would have been of the two cultures in the mid 19th century. And you also now would see massive loyalty of the Tongans and the Samoans with the LDS Church. Maybe in some way due to the fact that we didn't rip them out of their homes and stick them with white people. Now I'm just drawing a total, probably unrelated parallel, but for some reason those two examples kind of stick out of my mind.
Well, there is somebody working on a book like that, looking at that. So Amanda Hendricks Komodo has a book that should be coming out soon, drawing some of those comparisons and contrasts. And I think gender is also a really big part of her topic, which is kind of where I want to go next.
Okay.
I will mention too, Elise Boxer's got a book coming out about the placement program that really looks at some of the structural problems as well, that is worth noting. And another one is, I hope I say her name right, Holiani Akai, who does a Native Hawaiian woman who looks at Native Hawaiian experience within the church. And her book's been out for a number of years now, and does look at both the positive and the settler colonial structural problems, and probably should have been on my list of people to recommend to come talk on Mormon stories. So there's some good work happening in that area. Well, let's kind of transition a little bit more to some questions of gender. And here is in that title of my paper, the concept of seed. So sin, skin, and seed. Well, seed is a term that you see in both the Bible and the Book of Mormon. And this term is used to describe descendants. Okay, so the seed of Lehi, or the seed of Nephi, or the seed of Laman. Okay, and this concept actually borrows quite heavily from biblical kind of patriarchal models in the Bible. And so here you do have a concept that has an ancient and a modern component. And in the biblical models, this idea of seed is based upon an agricultural metaphor in which a male implants a seed into a female womb. Okay? And so that this idea kind of reduces the role of women in the reproductive process to equivalent to the soil. They're the dirt. And the male plants the seed grows into the human. Okay. And this was a pre-science understanding of or a folk biology of how reproduction occurs. Is clearly, from a modern biological perspective, mistaken in both the Bible and the Book of Mormon. And what it does is it leaves out the women's contribution. So women contribute half of the genetic endowment to their children, as well as providing a womb and providing nurturing in the early years of life, especially. And so women, those children, biologically speaking, are connected to the woman more so than the man. Okay, but in kind of patriarchal points of view that you see in biblical cultures and in the Book of Mormon, the children belong to the men.
So you have wording like bear unto Abraham.
Right. Instead of bear unto Abraham and Sarah.
Yeah.
So you, in a more accurate biological understanding, is that those children belong to both.
Right.
Okay? But culturally, we have a variety. Okay. So culturally, I mentioned before, patrilineal and matrilineal ways of understanding. Well, Native Americans have both patrilineal and matrilineal cultures, and Native America is one of the places where you see some of the much more common to see matrilineal inheritance than you see in many other parts of the world. So the importance of mothers also tells us about the cultural origin of these ideas. This tells us that the concept of seed that appears in the Book of Mormon is a old world concept, more likely than a new world concept. And it, again, reflects those agricultural metaphors. Now, the gender roles in the Book of Mormon reflect a 19th century settler colonial America rather than indigenous Americans, in which women are recognized and your heritage, is, especially in the New York area where Joseph Smith was, is passed on through your mother, so that you would belong to your mother's kin. So if you, for example, in the Haudenosaunee Nation or the Iroquois nations, the tribe you belong to is through your mother's line, and that if you are, like in my line, I have almost all my ancestors back to my Mohawk ancestor Susanna Ferguson Youngs, who lived in the late 18th century. There's a one man in that line, and because of that, I could not claim to be Mohawk. Okay, I can say I have Mohawk descent, but I don't. I have a break in that matrilineal line, and so that culturally takes away my ability to claim that as my kin. Okay, as the most important kin that I would belong to, the group that I would belong to.
Right.
And so recognizing that cultures vary in how we understand our relationships with our mothers and fathers. Another thing that's important to point out about gender in the Book of Mormon is that women are largely absent. And men take in almost all the religious and political leadership roles, including missionaries, okay, and an important occupational role of cultivating or tilling the land. Okay, in native cultures, it was the women who did the agriculture, at least in the New York area. So women were the ones who used digging sticks to plant corn, beans, and squash, and so on. And there was no tilling or plows in ancient America. That concept is a European concept
because there weren't beasts of burden to pull the plow.
Exactly, right. So that
Yeah.
goes back to what I said earlier about the connection between oxen and plows. The
Yeah.
two are tied together culturally. and so are gender roles. And so you get a rise.
Were the men more the hunters and the women more of the agrarians? Is that right?
Cultivators would be a good term to use.
Okay.
And men were more predominantly hunting, diplomacy, warfare.
Oh, right.
Were the social roles that were most important for men. And for women was, growing the crops, more of the care for the children. And in Haudenosaunee society, they actually elected the male representative. So the women had the vote, men held the offices. And so in the Haudenosaunee version of the Council of 50, or the Council of 50 that the Haudenosaunee had, women chose the men that represented them.
Gerardo, Thomas is kind of blowing my mind because we've, you and I have talked and thought a lot about like horses and cattle and sheep and wheat and barley and all of those anachronisms. But I've never thought of a social structure, gender roles as kind of anachronistic.
Yeah.
In addition to food and materials and technology.
Yeah, they're linked.
Right?
Yeah.
They're linked. Yeah. In other words, they reinforce each other
right
in their existence or non-existence.
Yeah, and they don't that's where those misnomers of saying one animal has got the wrong name. It's a whole entire cultural system of domesticated animals.
It's a man.
Changes.
It's a man.
Yeah.
Having a plow pulled by a horse or a horse or a cow. There was no man doing the cultivating. Yeah. There was no plow and there was no horse, right?
Right. And they're interconnected. This is what we call an ecological view of human cultures, right?
Right.
So far we have the dark and white skin as anachronistic, and then gender.
Yeah. So it really does show in an additional way the Book of Mormon is reflective of this 19th century context.
Yeah, and I do my best to reinforce this every chance I get, but it was a real shelf breaker for me when it was called to my attention that there were only like 6 female names in the entire Book of Mormon, and like 3 of them were like biblical characters, and like 1 or 2 of the 3 women are like whores or harlots or like
one is a prostitute, Isabel. The other one is Sarah, who is always complaining about Lehi's visions. Soraya. And then
Abish. Yeah. But like 150, I don't know, male names and 3 women's names. Like that's outrageous. And then what was also outrageous was that it wasn't until I was in my 30s where I even noticed that.
Right.
That's a problem, right?
Yeah.
That didn't bother me until my 30s or 40s. I was like, well, what's wrong with that? What's the problem? I mean, all of that is really problematic. If this is the most correct book of all history and time, God's one book, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And to an anthropologist, it tells me right away that this is a patriarchal culture, right? It tells me that this is a particular type of patriarchal culture because it has connections to specific animals that tie it to Europe and to the biblical world as well. And it really reinforces that cultural context.